Hello again. For the next hour, users of the Haywired scenario will tell their story. We start with some state and federal partners and then follow the volume 3 chapters of telecommunications, lifeline infrastructure, communities at risk, and business interruption. We conclude with forward-looking examples that integrate the Haywired scenario into our future with climate change. Dale Cox will get us started.
When SAFER creates scenarios, we do so with the communities most affected. An earthquake like that simulated in the Haywired scenario is of importance to all of California. For that reason, we work closely with the California Seismic Safety Commission, as they represent the community of California when it comes to all things seismic. Today, representing the California Seismic Safety Commission, I'm proud to introduce their chair, the distinguished Kit Miyamoto.
Hello, I'm in Haiti. Response for the earthquake happened on August 14th this year. That earthquake, 7.2, killed thousands of people and destroyed over 100,000 buildings like this one you're looking behind me. Haiti made a great progress though last 10 years. It does have the much higher capacity and the better buildings still exist, but still definitely a long way to go. In the California program, we have the Haywired. I think it's a fantastic program, to really to prepare the society of what's coming up in a realistic way. So not only public sector, but private sector and the people, businesses, schools, hospitals, they can be ready for it. Before this happens, I think that's a great program. Thank you.
Kit took a break from his earthquake reconnaissance in Haiti to bring it home to California. The Haiti earthquake shaking triggered hundreds of landslides. Our partner, the California Geological Survey, estimated the landslide initiations from Haywired shaking in the Bay Area. Tim McCrink, engineering geologist, explains.
Hello, Tim McCrink here. I want to talk a little bit about our participation in the Haywired scenario. We at CGS were responsible for developing the earthquake landslide hazard portion of the scenario. We were asked to use the best available science to estimate the extent and the severity of landsliding that might be triggered by this scenario event. We were also asked to be forward-looking in identifying new methodologies to improve the science for future applications. CGS is the state's primary organization for delineating earthquake hazard zones, which local governments use to assure that hazards are mitigated as a condition of getting building permits. Having prepared 29 earthquake hazard zones in the heart of the Haywired scenario area, we were in a unique position to contribute to this study. We at CGS were also very interested to see how our mapping could be used in a scenario like Haywired to estimate losses from future earthquakes. And overall, the scenario showed that it did reasonably well. Since our participation in Haywired, we have been providing the data we developed to several universities who are applying similar methodologies for statewide utility corridors. Going forward, the Haywired products will be a valuable resource for earthquake exercises, much like the 2008 shakeout scenario, which help us prepare for the next big earthquake. And when the next big earthquake does arrive, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area, we now have the knowledge base on where vulnerable buildings and infrastructure lie. This informs us on where to set up a physical earthquake clearinghouse, where to send geologic and engineering field staff, and ultimately where Cal OES should focus state, federal, and local emergency response resources. Thank you.
Meanwhile, in another state agency, the California Office of Emergency Services, Larry Collins, Deputy Chief of Special Operations and Hazardous Materials, will be instrumental in the response to a large earthquake in the Bay Area. Larry participated in the shakeout scenario when he was with the Los Angeles County Fire Department.
Hi, my name's Larry, and I'm here to discuss a little bit about the response aspects of the planning cycle that this Haywired update is giving us the opportunity to use as an active tool to prepare ourselves for what we know is inevitable in terms of a major earthquake in the Bay Area. We know the details may be a little different. We know it may even exceed some of the assumptions in the Haywired scenario, but that gives us a basis and helps us in the fire and rescue services prevent what could happen, which would be a black swan event that, in other words, no one expected it, and those things that have happened in black swan events in the past. We know that this is inevitable in California, in the Bay Area. So the fire and rescue agencies are actively preparing for that and using, in this case, the update of the Haywired earthquake scenario to plan against, so that we have a realistic approach, so that when the event does happen, we don't have a deer in the headlights kind of a scenario. The responders have planned for it. There's a plan in place. They implement the plan and go to work fighting fire and rescuing people from collapsed buildings, and knowing that that could take weeks of 24-hour operations, and we have plans in place for that. So I want to applaud everyone involved with the update of the Haywired scenario for giving us a realistic planning tool that now we can move forward and work with and prevent excess damage and life loss when the event occurs. Thank you very much.
From state to federal, Anne Rosinski tirelessly built up the Earthquake Clearinghouse for information collection and coordination, and ran functional exercises for the state. Today, Anne speaks to us in her current role of FEMA Region 9 Earthquake Program Manager.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm Anne Rosinski. I'm the Earthquake Program Manager in Region 9. The Haywired scenario and all earthquake scenarios are so helpful to provide context for our conversations about earthquakes. We're lucky that we don't have earthquakes very often, but then that means that it falls off people's radar. So having a detailed scenario that gives us a picture, a glimpse of what we can expect really helps us to think about what can we do under blue sky conditions before the event happens. So a scenario doesn't have to be worst case. We have an ability to change that scenario if we act now. And then by using the scenario for exercises, it helps us understand what some of our gaps are and some things that we can be thinking about responding to. And then afterwards, it helps us for identifying mitigation projects. And a great example for Haywired is it identifies buildings that have elevators, and smaller buildings have elevators that will, if they're pneumatic, they'll drop down to the first floor, but taller buildings, people are going to get stuck. So using that information, a local city planner, a public safety division, and fire department can work together and maybe map out where the tall buildings are in their jurisdictions and start thinking about when that earthquake happens, what kind of response are we going to need? These are the buildings that we're probably going to have to look at first. And maybe so you could do a public information campaign to the building owners that, like, hey, this is something you can be aware of. So those, to bring it back into focus, the scenario really helps to identify specific actions we can take before, during, and after. And on a personal note, the Haywired scenario is important to me because our FEMA Region 9 office is in Oakland, right a few steps from the Hayward Fault. So I make sure I keep comfortable shoes at my office and some extra pocket change in case I need to walk home. So that's my appreciation of the Haywired scenario.
Echoing Brian Steckler, no communications, no operations. We could not have investigated telecommunications in an earthquake without industry participation. John Erickson and Brian Lanier are past and present chairs of the TR14 Committee for Structural Standards for the Telecommunications Industry Association. Brian, Director of Broadcast Engineering at American Tower, is also the task group leader for seismic design standards and supplied the tower shaking damage thresholds for our Haywired analysis. John Erickson co-owned 2 structural engineering consulting firms specializing in telecommunications infrastructure. He helped Haywired reach consensus on estimating residual network capacity and the surge in use of the networks after the earthquake.
My name is Brian Lanier. I'm the current chairman of TR14, and myself and John Erickson, who you're going to hear from in just a second, got involved in the Haywired scenario and being asked about the resiliency of wireless networks. And that caused us to do some deep dive into our own ideas of what resiliency and redundancy for wireless networks looked like. And probably the biggest thing we learned from this is that structurally speaking, most wireless networks are fairly resilient. The fact that the earthquake loads can be significant, but the wind loads that they're designed to probably provide a pretty high level of resiliency to the infrastructure itself. We didn't really find that the earthquakes seemed to be a problem. If only they were a problem, usually on the really small, really short towers, and typically tubular monopole type structures. So we found that the structures themselves were highly resilient. But John's going to tell you in just a second here, what we found is other aspects of wireless networks were not nearly as resilient and robust. So John, you want to speak on that?
Hi, I'm John Erickson. So what Brian's alluding to is that in our industry, we had a perception that these structures were very resilient. So we didn't deal with the seismic as intensely as we would with wind. And so the scenario that we went through allowed us to redevelop through Brian's leadership some of the seismic parameters so that we can prove that more concretely to the governing bodies. But what we found while looking at analogous events like hurricanes is that the structures do great. The antennas and mounts tend to do all right. It just depends upon if they get hit by debris. Not an issue for earthquakes, obviously. And the biggest issue is access and maintaining power so that the services can continue. And those services also include the ability to feed the towers the information. So that would be microwave and fiber and the other things. So in our discussions with people that manage these networks, what we have found is that they need access. The roads need to be cleared. They need to have access to fuel. Temporary generators only operate for a short period of time. The equipment needs to be secured in the building so when it shakes, you don't drop all the racks to the floor. Those are the small things, the details that are important. But generally, these structures are very resilient and should not lead to, as a structure, cascading failures of the communication network.
And I think probably the last thing I'd add is that typically more cell sites leads to greater resiliency. Just from the standpoint of losing one cell site doesn't necessarily indicate that the entire area would lose service altogether. So it's almost better to build more cell sites with less resiliency than less cell sites with more resiliency. Although obviously you'd like to have the best of both worlds. So I think that's probably what we took out of this, what we learned, and hopefully that was knowledge that's useful for the group to move forward with policy, to make policy against.
Yep, thank you. And you drove our industry to look at seismic a little more proactively, and we've actually changed the standards to that end to help demonstrate what we believe the resiliency is. Thank you.
Don Prosnitz paid attention to the Haywired telecommunications study. He is a fellow at the Center of Global Security Research at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, situated near the Hayward Fault. However, Don is speaking to us today as a manager of the Walnut Creek Community Emergency Response Team communication efforts and the chair of the Contra Costa CERT Communications Committee.
Hi, I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about how Contra Costa County used the Haywired material in an exercise. In 2019, 370 volunteers, 10 cities, and the Contra Costa Emergency Operations Center participated in an earthquake exercise, basically to help CERT across our county. A successful exercise needs a realistic scenario. We chose the Haywired B scenario movie because we needed an event that would appeal to most of our cities, and most of our cities were along the 680 corridor in Contra Costa County. We specifically used the data that said the cell network was overloaded and that 911 would be non-responsive because we are amateur radio operators and we feel that we'll be needed in the event of a major earthquake in the East Bay. Haywired also provided a lot of material. We had to put together emergency messages. We transported something like 630 messages during the exercise, and we used things like landslides, levee breaks, all sorts of things that Haywired talks about. We prepared an after-action report that had to do with message handling for the communications, message content, and technical. A few suggestions for Haywired-like scenarios in the future. The movie you put together was especially useful to motivate our volunteers. In the future, if we had more detailed shape maps that show us where the shaking is the largest would help. And I think it'd be useful to consider scenarios for less urbanized areas that generally are less concerned with earthquakes. Thank you very much.
Telecommunications providers and subscribers depend on electric power supply. That prompts me to call on Jeff Bockhuber at Pacific Gas and Electric.
Hello, I'm Jeff Bockhuber, Director of Pacific Gas and Electric Company's Geosciences Department, and appreciate the opportunity to participate in today's rollout for the Haywired Scenario Volume 3 report. Some examples of how PG&E has used the Haywired scenario include as an additional alternative to compare against other Hayward fault earthquake scenarios in our earthquake damage models, as a basis for our 2020 annual earthquake exercise, and as a benchmark event for the evaluation of gas pipeline fault crossings and mitigation decisions. The findings from the Haywired scenario apply to PG&E both in the areas of policy and operations. For example, the scenario findings and related communications were useful to heighten awareness for seismic hazard for company leadership and drive support for seismic risk modeling and preparedness, including a specific seismic risk chapter for our California Public Utilities Commission general rate case. In the area of operations and emergency response, lessons learned from implementation of the Haywired scenario for the 2020 annual earthquake exercise informed emergency response planning for PG&E operations by highlighting the long restoration time that will be involved for a large Bay Area earthquake, and also lifeline interdependencies beyond our PG&E system. PG&E's effort to build resilience through connections includes our recent regionalization of operations as part of our Delivering for Our Hometowns, which provides greater connection and response for our local communities. This is demonstrated by our ongoing wildfire PSPS event response. Additionally, we support collaborative seismic research and participate in utility and agency mutual aid for emergency response and restoration. In summary, PG&E has found the Haywired scenario to be a useful tool for earthquake preparedness, planning, and mitigation. Thank you.
Water supply restoration depends on communications and power after an earthquake. Two water utilities share their insights. Roberts McMullins is a senior civil engineer at the East Bay Municipal Utility District. Rob's models damage and risk for drinking water systems. Jim Walbrink is the Director of Emergency Management and Business Resilience for San Jose Water. Jim is President of the California Water Wastewater Agency Response Network, CalWARN.
Well, hi everyone, this is Robert McMullen from East Bay MUD. East Bay MUD aided the USGS and its academic team to develop the Haywired predictive model to estimate damage and repair timeframes for the district's drinking water distribution system. The model predicts 5,500 breaks and leaks as a result of both the main shock and a series of aftershocks. Given the large-scale ground movement and area-wide disruptions, including transportation, energy, fuel, and other commodities, the model predicts that it would take over 6 months to restore 100% of the damaged water mains, and that the average East Bay MUD resident would be without water for 6 weeks. Currently, the district is using the Haywired results to refine its drinking water distribution system's pipeline replacement model, where an estimated earthquake-induced likelihood of failure will be introduced into the results. This information will help the district select priority pipelines for replacement that are fragile to earthquake damage. Then, earthquake-resistant pipeline systems can be installed to increase system resilience and decrease restoration times following a significant earthquake event. The results of the Haywired report provide the district an additional tool to guide risk reduction efforts and reemphasize the importance of maintaining strong lines of communication with interconnected utilities, cities, and counties. Currently, the district participates in an assembly consisting of 9 West Coast water utilities that share information on how to manage water utilities through a significant earthquake event. In addition, the district meets with cities and counties regularly to review and coordinate project schedules, as well as discuss emergency programs to better prepare the communities for earthquake preparedness.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to give you a quick update where we're at now compared to a year ago when we presented. Again, we still look at the critical infrastructure web and how we're all tied together, and that is important. The Haywired scenario has allowed us to do a lot of work mapping where we could have leaks, what critical infrastructure is in that area, like hospitals and substations and so forth. And we've been able to use this to do some very significant planning. In the area of emergency fuel planning, we've got a very good emergency fuel plan at the utility level. However, since last year when we discussed this, we haven't made as much progress on the city level and county level. We need to have a regional emergency fuel plan so that we're maximizing the benefit of getting one truck to multiple locations. We've done a lot of work with the acoustic leak technology. You can see the number of devices that have been put out there, and they've been phenomenal at finding leaks. 382 in the course of all of this. That saved us and our customers a lot of time and a lot of money. The next area that we've been working on is the emergency potable water. And in the past year, we've gone from the boxed water solution to bagged water, and we are going to be testing that with a full-scale exercise November 3rd. Along with that, we've developed the tables and the ergonomics to be able to fill these bags, get them ready for distribution to the public, and keeping our employees safe. Another area that we're working on right now is supply chain. It's become a big issue, and that's just over this past year. So there's a lot being worked there. And then finally, we have the dam surveillance technology, which is using LiDAR and VIDAR to be able to do pre and post dam assessments. And all of this was developed using the Haywired scenario. With that, I will turn it back over to our hosts.
While Jim looked out for water supply issues to hospitals, Phil Balin integrated Haywired hazards and lifeline infrastructure around our hospitals. Phil is the Geospatial Data Analytics Cell Manager for FEMA Region 9 Interagency Recovery Coordination.
Hi, I'm Phil. I just wanted to demonstrate and talk about how we use the abundance of digital data that's available to prepare for a potential earthquake, such as the Haywired. In this area on this map, you can see we have in yellow the Haywired fault. We have various hospitals and bridges. And I think one of the most important parts of our effort is to introduce the availability of this data to people, showing both the hazard potential areas and have them think about what would happen or how they'll have access to these facilities, such as these hospitals with the H on them, if we had an earthquake. And I think that the more information that's available to people, such as the USGS created all this great data about what damages the Haywired might create, if that were put into a web format and socialized at their meetings so that people could start adding it to their own web mapping systems, they could have these kind of discussions and run different scenarios. So I think we're going in a great way. There's a lot of data that's available, and I really appreciate the USGS's effort of outreach of what they've done and brought the science and into a way that emergency managers can communicate, and they continue to do so.
Sticking with hospitals, Diana Homsey will share her view of exercising for an earthquake within the University of California, San Francisco Hospital Healthcare System. Diana is the Deputy Director of the UCSF Police Department Homeland Security Management Team.
Hi, I'm Diana Homsey. Recently at the University of California, San Francisco, we utilized the Haywired scenario and the San Andreas fault scenario to conduct a damage assessment and windshield survey exercise series. The first part of our exercise series started with a seminar where we really drilled down into the scenario with presentations and looked at the reality of what the effects may be here, right here in San Francisco and in the region. UCSF has facilities in San Francisco and also throughout California. So it's really important to look at both scenarios and see what the effects could be. It gives a context to help educate all of the people participating in the exercise, including the engineers, the facilities folks, the architects, and real estate departments at UCSF, so we can really see how it affects everybody and how it affects the lifelines and the list of hazards that will affect those lifelines and what we need to do to continue our operations at UCSF. Many people really aren't familiar with the exact specific information that comes out of these scenarios. So it's extremely important for us to have that and know that they're built by professionals and scientists that help write these. And so that we're looking with essential data that we're taking in. And it helps us build our whole exercise series. It essentially gives us a list of things to look at and how we're going to move forward in exercising at UCSF or in any exercise program. Couple of the major things we look at is we're not going to get those resources coming in right away to San Francisco. We know that by looking at how the transportation routes will be down. So it's important for us to provide for ourselves. We have to look at communication and how we're going to work through that and make sure that we're using the old-fashioned kinds of system, because we know that communications with systems will be down. That's just a few of the ways that we find that these scenarios are extremely helpful to us in our exercise program.
Telecommunications, power, water, and hospitals are services that affect the function of communities on top of damages to our homes. Communities at risk in the Bay Area have used the Haywired scenario for mitigation and response planning. Jamie Albrecht was the local hazard mitigation plan coordinator for the City of Berkeley and co-wrote the 2019 update to the plan. Jamie currently manages the Community-Powered Resilience Program at Enterprise Community Partners.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jamie, and I'm so excited to be here this afternoon and talk about the Haywired scenario. So scenarios are very powerful tools for local hazard mitigation planning. They can help everyone involved in the process, planners, advocates, individuals, businesses, and community groups, anyone really truly understand what is possible and what the impacts might be in an earthquake. For a lot of folks, the reality of devastating earthquakes are hard to understand and imagine, especially for those of us transplants from the East Coast. So scenarios bring this to life in a way that people can grasp and help figure out opportunities for mitigation that are grounded in the reality of the devastating event. I truly appreciate the part of the scenario that focuses on the possible displacement impacts of our residents here in the Bay Area, which a lot of folks don't think about when they think about earthquake impacts. So we use the scenario at the City of Berkeley in both our written and digital version of the local hazard mitigation plan to really demonstrate the seriousness of earthquake risk and try to frame the strategy we need to mitigate that risk. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and bring up the digital local hazard mitigation plan that we created. And we created this to complement the paper plan and give people additional access to the information. So you can see on my screen here that I pulled the shaking intensity data from the scenario, the USGS ArcGIS data, and describe it here for people to understand. Visuals like this one are really helpful as people try to make sense of all this information. And this is one of the reasons I love maps. People can really start to understand the type of intense shaking that they might feel, and that might bring it to reality in a way it couldn't before. I really think that the best way to build resilience through connections is to fund our local government capacity to engage in relationship building with community partners. A lot of our local governments, like the City of Berkeley, don't necessarily have all the resources or staff to do all the amazing things that they want to do. I also think we need to fund community organizing so that there's time and energy for this very important work. There really aren't enough groups working at the intersection of community organizing and resilience, and I hope in the years to come, we'll see a lot more funding and resources for that. Thank you so much, and thank you to the USGS team.
I connected with Professor AJ Fass at San Jose State University Anthropology Department for guidance on meeting communities where they are at. The engagement process listens to the community's concerns about hazards and vulnerabilities and explores resilience opportunities before reflecting on haywired hazards and social vulnerabilities. Both Japantown and the Billy DeFrank Center in San Jose have participated. Jade Pereno, a student of AJ's, narrates the next video with Gabrielle Antelovich, president of the Billy DeFrank Center. This exchange fills a gap in census data and vulnerability analyses for the LGBTQ+ community.
Clarifying hazards, vulnerability, and disaster in San Jose. This project began as a partnership between San Jose State University, the U.S. Geological Survey, and the Billy DeFrank LGBTQ+ Community Center in San Jose. This is a citizen science project in which we collaborate with community members to enhance both community and scientific knowledge with the goal of utilizing it to produce a positive change to pressing social issues and their underlying causes. Gabrielle Antelovich, the president of the Billy DeFrank Center, suggested creating a queerified disaster preparedness plan. LGBTQ+ communities have unique experiences with hazards, vulnerability, and disasters, which often do not align with the general heteronormative approaches in sciences and disaster risk reduction, response, and recovery programs. In this presentation, we introduce some basic ideas and approaches to queerifying science and practice around hazards and disasters.
Part of disaster preparedness in the community is that you get to know your neighbors and you help each other out. But the LGBTQ+ community doesn't always have that luxury because our neighbors may not want to know us, our neighbors may dislike us or even hate us. And so we don't necessarily have that connection with people near us. So we have to have a different plan. So that's part of the plan, is to train people who can help people with resources, have 211 support our community, and making our building available. Part of what has to happen is that flyers have to include people that look like us. They need to have transgender flags and rainbows and queerified flyers and messaging that targets our community from the government, from the state, from the federal government, from the local government. Our people need to know that the government entities who are involved in disasters actually recognize us as real people. And that can make a huge difference between life and wanting life.
Now, Lynn von Koch-Leavitt, Executive Director of the California Strategic Growth Council, transitions us from our lives and communities to our livelihoods. In her former role as Deputy Secretary for Housing at the California Business, Consumer Services and Housing Agency, Lynn created the Outsmart Disaster campaign using the Haywired scenario.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be joining you all at the Haywired Volume 3 rollout. I appreciate being invited to this significant milestone in the Haywired scenario. In 2017, we partnered with the Haywired team to launch the Outsmart Disaster public engagement campaign. The Outsmart Disaster campaign had 3 core objectives. First, it was to improve the communication of disaster hazard science and engineering for use in decision-making processes. Second, it was to help understand and inform actions to reduce disaster risks. And third, to build community capacity to respond to and recover from disasters. We started by building out the Outsmart Disaster campaign website, which I invite you to explore, as a central landing place to share information and get this into the hands of businesses and local communities, the content that could help them focus on resiliency. It included a number of key elements that were all driven and informed by the scenario work. I would just like to flag the Resilient Business Challenge, which was a specific call to action. It had 5 baseline areas of planning and investment. And if a business completes the challenge, then they were designated a resilient business by the California Seismic Safety Commission. In 2020, we were able to bring on a professional management partner, the California Academy for Economic Development, who now runs the campaign full-time. They've been able to add another layer to the campaign that brings the content to our partners through different mediums. This really focuses on county and community focus areas, deep dive trainings, and a preview of the Resilient Business Challenge. We've also added a sustainability training for nonprofits that helps introduce the content to them in a way that meets their business model. And as we're now moving forward into year 4, it's always worth reflecting on the lessons learned as we built this campaign. The first that I'd really like to share with this group is on the interchangeability between earthquake preparedness and other natural disasters for small and mid-sized entities. As we as a state have grappled with so many natural disasters over the last couple of years, it's amazing how many times the information that came through the Haywired scenario is applicable to additional natural disasters. Now, today, what I like a lot about this conversation is this resilience through connections. For me, connection is key. It's both about the physical infrastructure connectivity, but also the connections between people, which is done, I think, through coordination and communications. So one of the critical findings on Haywired was the focus on connections and interdependency within communities. The evaluation of the physical lifelines showed the compounding effect natural disasters have given the high level of interconnectivity that exists in our modern society. Now, in the long term, we have to have strategies around adaptation, but in the short and medium term, we need an emphasis on resiliency to make sure and promote the well-being of our communities. Now, as it's related to connections between people, information is just vital, and we know that people are more receptive when they trust the messenger. So continuing to bring forward scenarios and continuing to have a community and local focus is critical to resilience through connections occurring. And I think also the inclusion in targeted information for those who've been hardest hit by natural disasters and who are most vulnerable is an important highlighted note. Also, we need to be continually making the message on resiliency connect to what is happening to people in their world right now. So for instance, making sure that we're thinking about pandemics when we're talking about natural disaster planning and curriculum, really focusing on resiliency and sustainability, and always remembering that repetition of information helps really connect and make sure that the resiliency message gets to those who need it the most. And so thank you so much for being here today and for inviting me to join the discussions, and I look forward to continuing the communications.
Fiona Raymond Cox and Tonya York, past and present presidents of the Business Recovery Managers Association, are leaders in outsmarting disaster. Fiona is founder and principal of her business continuity and emergency planning firm. Fiona led Haywired workshop discussions and reviewed the Haywired exercise toolkit. Tonya York has built resilience programs from the ground up and is currently the business continuity program manager at Anaplan.
I'm going to share my experience of leveraging the Haywired scenario for a tabletop exercise. We were engaged by a Bay Area client to design an exercise that would widely impact their operations. Incorporating materials from the Haywired scenario to create a very believable and detailed exercise allowed us to focus on our client and their response. Ultimately, the objective was to test the ability to transfer operations between primary and alternate incident management teams. Haywired addresses loss of infrastructure in the Bay Area and ongoing aftershocks. We used this data to present participants with customized injects to highlight operational impacts they had to contend with. We facilitated part 1 of the exercise from the client's alternate incident management team location. Beginning 32 minutes after the 7.0 earthquake, ensured communications to and from the Bay Area would be challenging and information about the extent of the earthquake would be scant. The exercise progressed through the first 2 days following the earthquake. We facilitated part 2 of the exercise at our client's primary incident management team location in the Bay Area. We picked up the narrative when the primary incident management team would likely take command and control of the incident, and a handoff from the alternate team would be required. We continued to leverage the Haywired scenario to ensure that the team addressed earthquake issues like accounting for staff, death and injury, facility damage, transportation issues, ongoing communication outages, uncertainty of resources, and service availability. Using Haywired for a credible scenario that participants could not fault and that allowed us to focus on impacts to our clients' operations was very helpful. The exercise forced the team to consider and address how to transfer authority from one team to another often an overlooked issue, which in this case resulted in improved resiliency for our client. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.
The Haywired series of materials have been very, very helpful to me in my career. And one of the basic uses that I have for the information is as a scenario for a tabletop exercise. At Lamb Research, I used Haywired as the scenario for our tabletop exercise with the CEO and his executive staff in planning for an earthquake. The material was very effective, especially in an organization such as that with many, many scientists, right? PhDs everywhere. And so the material that came out of that from USGS, from, the various municipalities and local and federal governments and police, fire, and medical really resonated with everyone. And out of that, we were able to make changes to supply chain, to how we delivered our goods and services to our customers, to managing our workforce in the event of an earthquake. And I think if you take what is in that material, in the Haywired material, and you look at what our experience has been in the pandemic, I think the synergies would be that in many cases, parts of our communities are going to be impacted for a long time. And in the pandemic, we saw that with our children in the impact of being out of school for such a long time. And I think we can take those learnings and we can apply them to our future as we plan for a Haywired type of event.
We close with speakers that look into the future of Haywired with climate change. Although unable to participate today, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission inserted the Haywired scenario along with sea level rise into their regional futures planning. Michael Germerard spoke about this in our Haywired Economic Research and Practice webinar. I and the Hayward project team were honoured to receive a Metro Award in 2019. Some of you in the Haywired Coalition perceptively asked, how will the Bay Area liquefaction hazard increase with sea level rise? Alex Grant, a research engineer at the USGS, specialises in regional scale landslide and liquefaction hazards and risk. Alex responds to your question.
Thanks, Anne. I'll be talking a bit about our work on liquefaction in the Bay Area responding to the Haywired scenario. But first, liquefaction is a loss of strength in soils caused by the interaction of earthquake shaking, soil saturation, and susceptibility that can result in significant ground movement and damage to infrastructure. And it's been documented in major earthquakes for over a century, causing pipeline and roadway damage, as well as damage and collapse of structures, as shown in some of these examples to the right. What the Haywired scenario enabled us to do is respond to a question posed by emergency managers around the Bay as to the potential interaction between climate change and sea level rise from the Haywired scenario. So specifically what we've looked at is taking the shaking expected from Haywired and combining that with models of sea level rise moving forward in time from 0 to 5 meters of sea level change, and how that would affect liquefaction potential around the Bay in different soil types. And one of the key findings of this work so far has been identifying certain types of soils, particularly here shown in Alameda County, that are particularly sensitive to sea level rise, where things like artificial fill, shown in red, are highly sensitive to these changes and present what is potentially a much increased hazard moving forward in time. And then working with people like Anne to try and communicate these hazards back to emergency managers so that they can plan for future scenarios and kind of future Haywired earthquakes. Thank you.
A story map of this project will be available soon. Last but not least, the City of Palo Alto asked, how will decarbonisation impact the resiliency of single-family homes after an earthquake? Shiva Swaminathan is a senior resource planner and part of a team facilitating the efforts by the city to lower its carbon footprint. He works on initiatives to electrify transportation and buildings.
This summer, when the city of Palo Alto explored the impact of decarbonization on the resiliency of single-family homes, our research fellow Shoja Jahangard from Stanford University found Chapter T of the Haywired Earthquake Report most applicable to our research. The report was useful when examining the resiliency of the natural gas and electric supply systems. In particular, the relative resiliency of the two infrastructure systems in the aftermath of an earthquake. We found the electric power restoration curves in the report most useful. The simulated curves showed the time periods over which services could be restored. Though our research could not come up with a definitive conclusion on whether the electric supply system or the natural gas supply system was more resilient, the report provided valuable insights. Now, when I think about the concept of resiliency through connections, in Palo Alto it means building connections at the block and neighborhood levels to help each other in emergency situations. It means our emergency service volunteers coming together to share their expertise. It could be a ham radio operator, a medical volunteer, or a block preparedness coordinator. As an engaged and informed community, Palo Alto is focused in maintaining and enhancing our community resiliency through connections. In closing, we are thankful to Anne Wayne for guiding our study this summer and making additional connections to aid our research. We also want to thank Anne for her service as a neighborhood preparedness coordinator in Palo Alto. Thank you.
20 thanks to 20 speakers who retold the Haywired scenario story through their use of it today. Before we go to spatial chat, heartfelt thanks to everyone who has participated today as speakers, chatters, and listeners. I personally have been honored to connect with you all. You enrich our efforts at USGS to deliver science that can be used. You make it real and meaningful and a story that can be told. A big shout out to the mastermind of producing our event today, Cara Gross with Joint Venture Silicon Valley. She calmly and methodically took on my vision for integrating over 50 contributions and the spirit of resilience through connections. Thank you, Cara.